Question: Coleridge's criticism of Wordsworth's theory of poetry and poetic diction. The most remarkable part of Biographia Literaria lies in Coleridge's criticism of Wordsworth's theory of poetry and poetic diction. While critically analyzing Wordsworth's theory, Coleridge has offered his own views on the choice of rustic themes and characters as well as the language of poetry. In chapter XV2 or 17 of Biographia Literaria, Coleridge refers to Wordsworth's preface to the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads. In this preface, Wordsworth made three important statements, which Coleridge found unacceptable. First, Wordsworth asserts that the proper diction of poetry consists in the language or the real conversation of men under the influence of natural feelings. So, his choice humble and rustic life. Coleridge says that this statement is imperfect and contradictory. The characters that Wordsworth uses in his poems are not chosen from low and rustic life. Coleridge also argues that the language and sentiments of those characters do not necessarily arise from their social standing. Moreover, Coleridge opines that Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction can be applicable to certain classes of poetry only, but it can never be a rule of general application. By examining Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction, Coleridge maintains that the language of the rustic, purified from its defects and grossness, will not differ materially from the language of any other man of common sense. He points out that the experience of the rustic is very limited, and so they cannot think logically. They are unable to connect with fact and express themselves logically as an educated man can. Therefore, the language of the rustic lacks expressive visions and rank, making itself unfit for poetry. Giving his critical assessment of the language of prose and poetry as reflected in Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction, Coleridge objects to the ambiguity in the use of the word real. Wordsworth maintains that the language of poetry is selection of the real language of man. Coleridge argues that everyone's language varies according to the extent of his knowledge, the activities of his faculties, and the depth and quickness of his feelings. Every man's language has its individual characteristics. He points out that the language used in the poems of Wordsworth differs greatly from the language of a common peasant. Coleridge opines that for the word real we should substitute the word ordinary. Moreover, a common uncultivated mind, overpowered by a strong passion, can utter broken words or repeat the sets of words and phrase known to him already. It would be very difficult for a poet to make such language fit for poetry. Coleridge also disagrees with Wordsworth regarding the statement that there neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. Coleridge asserts that there ought to be an essential difference between the languages of prose and poetry. Coleridge argues that language of written prose obviously differs from that of common conversation in the same way as reading differs from talking. Even though some words are common to prose and poetry, they are differently arranged in the two compositions, making the language of the two essentially different. This difference arises from the fact that the poetry uses meter and meter requires a different arrangement of words. Coleridge has already pointed out that meter is not a mere superficial decoration but an essential organic part of a poem. Therefore, there must be an essential difference between the language of prose and that of poetry. The use of meter creates a different atmosphere in poetry, and the metaphors as well as similes used by a poet are different in quality. Thus, Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction is critically examined by Coleridge in his Biographia Literaria. While making an assessment of this view, Coleridge offers his own views on the language of poetry in general.